Hello, everyone. Hi. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MD Consultants Facebook Live Q&A. Today, I'm going to be answering some of your questions about medical school interviews. So I'll just introduce myself here a little bit. My name's Emma. I'm a first-year medical student at the University of Toronto, and I'll give a little background, I guess, my academic background. So I went to Queen's for Life Sci, and luckily, I was actually able to get into medical school out of third year, so I didn't end up completing my fourth year and didn't end up doing a master's. So for my interviews, I was lucky enough to get four. So I interviewed at the University of Toronto, University of Ottawa, Queen's, and then McMaster. And then I was also able to then get into all four. So I had kind of that decision between which I should go to. So I'm able to talk about my experience at all four schools interviewing, with the exception of McMaster, because with the COVID pandemic, they actually ended up canceling interviews. So I don't have personal experience actually interviewing there. Again, because of the COVID pandemic, I did have my Queen's interview online. So that was different for some people. Some people had the earlier interview slot and um, were able to go in person, but because of COVID, I ended up being online. So I'm going to be able to talk about all of those interview experiences. And I have a list of questions here that I'll be answering regarding medical school interviews. But if anyone has any questions during the duration of this taping, please feel free to ask them in the comment section, and I'll try and answer them for you live. Um, all right, so I'll start off with the first question here because I don't see any comments. So what advice can you give about preparing for medical school interviews, and what is my top advice? So I think the number one thing I would say is to practice. I think the more that you feel comfortable talking about your experiences and talking about your want to go into medicine, the more natural it's going to become when you're actually talking in front of your interviewers. So something that I did, which I think is really, really important, is I would meet up with friends and we would practice just doing interviews back and forth. Um, and kind of asking questions and using different time limits. So if we were practicing for an MMI, I would actually put on a timer, and my friend and I would talk for the 7 minutes or whatever it was, and then get feedback back from them. And it was important that I chose to do these prep sessions with friends who were going to be really honest and give me that really vital feedback, because if you're going to just be getting, oh, good job all the time, then that's not going to help you improve. So that was something that I did. Something else that I think is really important is to kind of base your answers off of the CAN-MEDs. So for those who don't know what the CAN-MEDs are, they're basically these 6 characteristics that the medical schools in Ontario, and I think in Canada in general, have decided are what makes a good doctor. So they are collaborator, communicator, leader, health advocate, scholar, and professional. And so what I did is beforehand, when I was kind of on my own, I would write out all the CAN-MEDs and then write a situation or an experience in which I both showed an example of that CAN-MED, so showed a time where I was a good communicator. And then I wrote out a time where I was not a good communicator, because those are kind of what the medical schools will base a lot of their questions off of. So when I was able to do that, I wouldn't necessarily write out a script for myself, because you really do not want to sound scripted. That's a really negative of something you can do during an interview. But I would write out an idea, or write out, a quick summary, or the name of a story if I kind of made up had like a list of things that I had done in my life and in my time, and then be able to quickly pull on that during interview practice. Um, so kind of with those things in mind, I did a lot of practice with friends. I think kind of peak interview season for me was between February and the end of March, and I was meeting a couple times a week, whether that be with friends or doing practice on my own. As I got closer to my Queen's interview, which was online, and it was going to be videos that were going to be recorded, I actually practiced turning on my camera and recording myself through a video on the computer, and listening back to myself with the time limits, the MMI time limits, and with different questions, and then being able to see what I can improve on, whether I was using my hands crazy, which I'm definitely a hand talker, but just being able to kind of control that and being able to see and reflect that by watching the screen, or if I was talking too quickly, or other things such as that. So I think it's definitely a positive to practice, and then to get good feedback, whether that be from yourself and watching your own videos, or from a friend. Something else that I took advantage of was actually the services they have here at the MD Consultants. I had my own consultant, and I did a consultant session before each interview. It was kind of a final prep to make sure I had everything to get their kind of more professional opinion on what I can improve on. So that was really helpful for me to kind of get that feedback from somebody who's gone through the process and to see kind of what my answers are and what my interview style is, and if there's anything I can kind of change. So that's definitely a piece of advice. So I guess if I were to summarize, my two pieces of advice would be number one, to practice, practice, practice. And then number two, make sure that you know stories in advance, you know your can meds, and you know times that you've showed positives and negatives of each of those. Those are the two pieces of advice there. So I'll move on to the next question. I still don't see any comments with questions. So what was my biggest fear about interviewing for medical schools, and how did I overcome this? Okay, so I think definitely right off the bat, my biggest fear was being red flagged. So for those who don't know what being red flagged is, it's basically where you say something during an interview and you get a red flag on your application, and it's very, very bad to receive a red flag, and it gets reviewed, and then it's likely if you get a red flag, you're not going to be accepted. So I was very, very nervous about getting red flagged, because my understanding of red flags was that if you say something dumb or you say something that's not very smart, you'll get a red flag. But I very quickly learned from talking to other medical students who, were already in medical school, that that is not at all what a red flag is. A red flag is when you say something really bad, so something racist or homophobic or ableist, or basically anything that's really, really hurtful. And so in that instance, you would get a red flag. So once I knew that that was not something that was going to happen to me, because I didn't kind of possess those ideas, then I was able to relax and kind of be myself a bit more. So I think definitely when you have these fears, it's really important to reach out to medical students who have gone through the interview process, who can kind of reassure you that that's not going to happen, or reassure you that you're not going to slip up and say something that you would never normally say. So that kind of was able to calm my nerves, and that was my biggest. So I just received a question here. So how early would you recommend prepping for interviews? Do you think it's worth beginning preparations before receiving invites, or do you think the extra time could have helped? So that's a great question. I actually started doing interview prep. I started right as soon as I got back to school from second semester, so right in that kind of first week of January. And I actually ended up doing only one day of interview prep before I got my first interview, because I got my MAC interview on a Tuesday, I think, the first Tuesday back to school. And I had started interview prep on the Monday. So for me, I started, one day before, which I can't say whether that was necessarily beneficial, that one extra day. But I was also lucky in that instance to get a really early interview invite, which doesn't always happen. Some of my friends who got accepted to multiple schools and got interviews to multiple schools didn't end up hearing back until mid-February or even March, just because where their interviews happened to get placed was later in the time. I guess also something that I should clarify is that certain schools release their interview invites all at once. So that's like McMaster. And then other schools like University of Toronto will release them every 3 weeks. They'll release another kind of round of interview invites. So the earlier, I guess, you get your interview, you're going to have more time to prep, but also your interview will be sooner. So usually they release an interview invite, and then it's 3 weeks later that your actual interview will be. So I found that prepping early was really beneficial, because I only had my one MAC interview at the beginning of January. I was actually just prepping for MAC, and that's an MMI style, but I kind of was integrating some of those other things that you'll have in the other styles, like the panel interview, into my practice. And I did find that having all that kind of prep, by the time I ended up getting to the time where I actually had my Queen's interview, which is at the end of March, I think, or it might have even been in April. I had been prepping at that point for 3 months, and I felt really confident in my answers. And I actually think that my Queen's interview was my best interview, where I felt the most confident in my answers and I felt the most comfortable speaking. So I definitely think that starting to prep early is going to be beneficial. If you end up prepping really early and you don't end up getting an interview, then you know what? At some point in your life, you're going to end up getting an interview, whether that be to medical school the following year or to a job. And so I don't think there's any negatives to starting to prep for an interview early. So I would definitely start as early as you kind of have time to. Um, so I'll go on here to the next question. Um, Hopefully that answered your question. If it didn't, just put another comment in, and I can kind of further elaborate on that. So the question is, in your opinion, do you think the pandemic will cause interviews to change going forward? So this is an interesting one. So I can kind of see the negatives and the positives for both. So I think one of the big positives to the interviews being online, which is how I believe they're happening this year and happened for the end of my interview season last year, um, is that going to interviews is quite expensive. So when I had to go to my Ottawa interview or to my U of T interview, I had to rent a hotel, I had to get a train ticket, and then kind of your food and all that kind of thing to go to the interview was expensive. But I do think that the positives of going to the school outweigh that. And I think that the medical schools know that and will continue, and I think in the future, to be in person. One of the things that I thought was really impactful, so I got to go to my U of T interview in person. And when I went to my U of T interview, U of T was not my top choice medical school, which is actually where I'm at now. So it wasn't my top choice, but when I went to interview day, they kind of had a whole day planned for us. I arrived really early. They took us through presentations. They took us through tours of the hospital and through the medical school. We got to meet a lot of other medical students and have them talk to us and kind of give that personal information, and being able to sit there in person and really have a connection with the medical students that are there or get to see the environment of the school, I think was a huge positive and was one of the major reasons why I ended up going to U of T for medicine. And so I do think that the medical schools understand the positives of being immersed in the environment. And I do anticipate in future years we would go back to in person. But I think at this point with COVID, it's going to continue to be online. Um, so the next question is, in your opinion, do you think there are advantages or disadvantages regarding the virtual interviews? So I think, as I kind of mentioned before, one of the advantages is that it definitely saves you money because you don't have to pay for that travel expense. I think one of the other positives is that um, you're really able to feel comfortable in your interview. You don't have to kind of worry about things like, am I going to get there on time, or um, does my whole outfit look good? Or I remember something kind of funny during my U of T interview. My shoes that I wore heels, and they were just a little bit too tight, and I actually ended up getting very, very severe, very, very bad blisters that were kind of bleeding into the bottom of my shoe. Sorry if that's kind of grosses anyone out, but and so that was something that was kind of in the back of my mind because I was uncomfortable. But when you're online, you can kind of be comfortable in your own house, and you do still have to be formal, but kind of just on top. No one will know if you're wearing your pajamas on the bottom. So that I think is a positive. And you also have a better experience being able to practice. So something that I would recommend doing, like I mentioned, is just practicing videotaping yourself, and you can kind of watch yourself and then practice exactly how it would be on the real thing. I guess the negative to that would be, I know that if I was in person and I was saying something and my interviewer kind of gave a weird face, I was able to better detect that, oh, I should not say this, or oh, maybe I should go in a different direction for those interviews that I was kind of face to face. And just to clarify as well, the online interviews, there's two formats in which they're done. So one of them is where you get a question, and it's through a system. You get a question, and then immediately your camera will turn on, and you just have to answer, and you're answering kind of to a blank screen. So you don't get to see that other person on the other side. But the other alternative is kind of a Zoom call style setup where you get to see your interviewer. So I guess where it's the positive is that you will, in the instance in which there's not another person there, you don't have to feel nervous about making that eye contact or trying to make that connection. You can kind of say your piece, and it feels more relaxed. But when you do have the Zoom call, you can kind of see your interviewer's face and try and make those connections with them. I think one of the other disadvantages of the virtual interview is not getting to see the school. So you don't get to see where you'd be, you don't get to try and imagine yourself, and you don't really have that opportunity to talk to medical students who are at the school. Um, and then kind of get the sense of what it will be like. Although I would encourage you, if you are interviewing, to reach out if you know any med students, or even through your interview invite, I'd imagine that they'd have a list of emails of medical students that you could reach out to. Once you're kind of in medical school, which is nice, you have a bit more free time, I think, than I did in undergrad. I think a lot of med students are very, very willing to kind of give advice and to talk to you about the experiences that they have in medical school. Um, yeah, if that answers that question, I'll probably move on to the next here. So I kind of answered this question already, which is, when did you start prepping for interviews, and did I wait till I received an interview invitation? So as I mentioned earlier, I did not wait. I did start before I got an interview, but I happened to get an interview the next day. So I would still recommend starting to prep for interviews before you receive an offer, and hopefully you're as lucky as me and you'll get an interview invite right off the bat, and you won't be prepping for too long before you get that confirmation that you have one. Okay, so how can you avoid interview fatigue? So this is definitely something that I personally experienced. As I've mentioned previously, I had 4 interviews, and they were all kind of 2 to 3 weeks apart. And so in those two to 3 weeks, I was also in school and had midterms, and was trying to study and keep up my regular life. And so I did find it challenging to kind of reduce that fatigue. But what I would say is, be nice to yourself. After an interview, don't go home and lay in your bed and reflect upon every single thing that you said that wasn't very dumb, or wasn't very smart. Um, I I did that sometimes, I'm not going to lie, and I definitely had some of those answers that I had given kind of running through my mind for weeks, and then if not months after my interview, and all the way up until the day that I luckily got my acceptance. But by decreasing that and trying to be nice to yourself and be cognizant that they just want nice people, then I think you're going to be more likely to feel calm and not have that fatigue. I would also say that it's important to kind of celebrate after you're done your interview. Instead of going back and worrying about stuff like that, celebrate. You're done. You get to have that release of stress and kind of take that time to be happy that you're done. I remember after my U of T interview, I had to come down to Toronto from Kingston, and some of my friends actually came with me, and we went out and celebrated, and we went to dinner, and went to a bar after, and kind of got to celebrate me having done my first interview, and it was really nice. So I would definitely say, be nice to yourself and celebrate those accomplishments of even just being done interviews, regardless of how well you think it went. um, okay, so the next question here is, what style of interview do you think was the easiest slash hardest to prepare for? MMI, panel, or MPI? So this is a really great question. So I was lucky to have experience in all of these types. I found the hardest to prepare for was definitely the MMI. So for those that don't know what that kind of means, MMI is multiple mini interviews. And basically how it works is, you will be presented with a question, and you'll have 5 to 7 minutes, depending on the school, to just answer. And so the interviewer will not kind of join in on the conversation. They won't add comments. You literally will just talk at them for 5 to 7 minutes. And so that one I struggled with, because I think at the beginning we're trained as people to provide concise answers, and which is true. You still want your answer to be concise and pointed and have purpose, but also it's a little bit challenging to learn how to just talk flat out for 5 to 7 minutes. And so I think that definitely comes with practice. It comes from learning how to structure your answers. And so with MMIs, I think it's always a good idea to kind of have this structure, and then you put your thoughts into each of them. So maybe you repeat the question back, you elaborate into who this question impacts, maybe what are the positives of the different options. If it's a what would you do if, then give the positive of if you did one thing, and then the negative if you did that, and then a positive that you did of another thing, and then a negative of that, and then kind of end by a summary of why you would choose the answer that you did. And I think that that's kind of the most challenging, because you have to just learn how to talk just flat out with no response back. Panel I found was the easiest because you are sat down, you get to kind of know your interviewers, you can get a kind of a good conversation going, a good rapport. And I had a panel during both my Ottawa and my Queens, and those were the interviews that I enjoyed the best, that I think I did the best in, just because I think that's all about how you connect with people. If you're really a people person, which I think that many people going into medicine or hoping going into medicine are, then I think it's easy to kind of make those connections. And you also have the opportunity to have that first impression but then relax a bit and get comfortable with who you're talking to so you're not stressed again about making that impression, and then just kind of talk. I will say one of the positives with the MMI style or even the MPI, and the MPI is a mini panel interview. So I guess I'll go into that in just a second. But the positives with the MMI or the MPI is that you get to make that first impression again and again. So with each one, if you feel one station went bad, you can completely forget about that station and move on to your next. And so that's definitely a positive. And my understanding of McMaster, although I received an interview invite, but I didn't actually get to interview there because of COVID because they were canceled. But they will take away your lowest MMI score. So if you do bad on one station, then just forget it because it won't even count towards your score, is my understanding. And then for MPI is a mini panel interview. So I would say that this was probably a very close second to the panel interview because you have those multiple stations, but you get to kind of have more rapport and more of a conversation with your interviewer. So at my University of Toronto interview for one of my MPI stations, for the first probably 3 or 4 minutes, I was just, small talking, just chatting with my interviewer before we got into really any of the questions. So we were talking about where I went to dinner the night before and how I've enjoyed the city and the fact that we happened to get a random huge snowstorm the day of the interview. And so I think that that kind of helps you to come at ease, and then you can get into those questions and you still get to build those relationships, but have the opportunity to have these new first impressions, which I think is really nice as well. Um, and yeah, so I would say the panel, just in terms of what's the easiest to prepare for, the panel is just kind of developing um, those conversational things, and the MMI, it's just harder to kind of learn how to talk, just as a summary. So something here is, what is the best way to prepare for some of those tell me about yourself type questions? So this is a very typical question. It's most commonly asked, I think, in panel style interviews or MPI style, where they kind of get to know you for a bit and you can kind of chat for a little bit longer than you would in an MMI. So I think some of the main things that you want to get into in the tell me about yourself, and I'll actually the next question that follows this is tell me the best way or tips to approach a why medicine question. And I will say that in my experience, these questions have been combined. So it's been phrased in a way that's tell me about yourself and why you wanted to go into medicine. And so I actually found it helpful for me when I was answering these questions to kind of integrate different parts of the questions, of each of the questions, into one. And so even if I had just been asked, tell me about yourself, or had just been asked, why medicine, I would have still integrated parts of the opposite question into that answer, because I think that kind of helps you to answer better. So then when I was presented with a question, a combo question of tell me about yourself and why medicine, I was able to give this one concise answer that told about both. And had I been given one or the other, I would have been able to, again, kind of integrate the ideas of the other. So the tell me about yourself question, I think it's important to kind of go in this chronological order of how you've become the person that you are today. So I started off when I was younger and kind of talking about my upbringing and how I learned to be social and kind of got to integrate these key characteristics about myself. So what I actually did to formulate this question was I wrote down a list of all of my best character traits and what I want them to know is about me. So I wrote down that I'm really social and that I can talk to people and that I have this desire for problem solving. And so I wrote down all these things that are also great attributes of the CanMeds and also great attributes of what they probably want in a doctor. And I was able to kind of tie in little stories all the way through that gave them that picture of who I was and also got to see these great positive attributes. And I also was able to tie in some of my passions so they can kind of relate to me and understand. And so I talked about the fact that I moved around a lot, and so that as a kid, and so that allowed me to learn how to make friends quickly and be social. And so that's kind of something I find appealing, that I enjoy, is just talking to new people. And then for the why medicine question, I think it's really important to not just say that you want to help people, because that I think is too basic, or it doesn't go into depth about why you want to go into medicine, because you could say I want to help people, and that could be you being a firefighter. That could be you being a nurse. That could be you being a teacher. You want to talk specifically, what is it about medicine that says this is what I want to do? So some of the things that I thought about was the fact that you meet new people every day, that it's very much a problem solving profession, that um, you enjoy getting to work on these complex problems. You like working in a team. And so kind of getting to integrate why each of those things are things that you really thrive in and that you want for the rest of your life, and being able to tie that into the why, tell me about yourself question, and be able to answer those kind of questions or show how you have those skills to do those things, I think is a really big positive. So I would definitely spend some time thinking about these questions. They're very typical and very common. um, yeah. But what I would caution you against is to write out a script. As I mentioned earlier, the absolute last thing that you want to do is sound scripted. So if you can kind of write out bullet points about things that you want to talk about, that will then more easily translate into a very fluid and conversational discussion of telling them about yourself and telling them why you want to go into medicine. And so I think that that's probably one of my best pieces of advice. And then to that, I would also, again, practice giving these answers, and practice giving these answers to other people. So say it to a friend, say it to a roommate, say it to an MD consultant, say it to a medical student that you're friends with. And I think that it's going to show up positively if you kind of get feedback and get what other people's impression is of it. Um, Another thing I'll just note before moving on to the next question is I do think that this is one of the first questions that are most commonly asked in a panel or in an MPI. So I think there's always a positive to kind of putting a joke in. So I know that with mine, I had kind of a cute story with a little bit of a joke in my very beginning of this kind of question, or my answer to these types of questions. And so I think that that can be a positive. It doesn't have to be a hilarious joke, but just kind of something to both make yourself laugh and then also the interviewer, just because it kind of loosens up that tension. Yeah, and I will say that. The interviewers are not looking for a perfect person. They're looking for someone who they can work with in the future. A lot of the times, for some of these schools, they actually have medical students on the panel, or medical students are interviewing, or residents are interviewing. And so these people who are interviewing you are not going to be some old guy that by the time you get to be an actual attending, they've retired. These are your actual colleagues who may be a few years older than you, but that when, once you're an attending, that doesn't mean much. So they're looking for that person who they're going to get that consult from, or who's going to be scrubbing in next to them. They're not looking for this kind of superstar person. They're looking for a great colleague, someone who's passionate, someone who's personable, and someone they want to work with. And so that, I think, is something to really keep in mind, and just be yourself, and be a nice person. Those are what they're looking for. So the next question here, I'll move on. If anyone wants any further elaboration, let me know. Is how long after interview should you expect a notice of acceptance or rejection? So how it works in Ontario, and I'm not super familiar with how it is in other provinces or in the States, although my understanding is that they have a set day for those as well. But in Ontario, all the acceptances slash rejections will come out on a certain day. So for me last year, it was May 12th. May 12th at 9:30 a.m., I knew what schools I had been accepted to. And so you can have an interview as early as, my first interview was February 8th, and then you have to kind of wait those very long months, and it feels really long. But if you keep yourself busy, the time will pass quickly. And so you wait that time, and then you'll find out from all the schools at the same time on that day. And then you could, in theory, be waitlisted, in which point they'll kind of do on a rolling basis as people deny their offer to that school. If you're on that wait list, you'll get accepted. So I have friends who were accepted to one school, but then waitlisted on their preferred school. And I believe you have 2 weeks to decide after they send out your initial acceptance or rejection to either to accept. And so, as somebody else will deny that school, they were then offered that acceptance offer, so they were able to actually go to their preferred school, even though they were on waitlist initially. They were quickly taken off of it and then given their spot. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. So our next question here, what's the biggest misconception about interviewing for medical schools? So I think I touched on this a bit earlier, but I think it's this idea that the medical schools want a perfect person. They want somebody who's flawless, who doesn't stumble over their words, who doesn't say who is perfect. And I really don't think that's the case. What they want, as I mentioned, they want a colleague. They want somebody who's going to be smart and hardworking and be a good problem solver and a great team member. And so I think once you get to that interview stage, you no longer need to show that you had a 4.0 GPA or a 520 MCAT. They're getting to know you as a person and getting to know whether they think that you would be a good team member or somebody that they want to work beside. So I think that you should have a greater focus in your interviews on who you are as a person, and that they're not trying to catch things that you mess up on. They're trying to figure out, can I work with this person? If you say something that's not very smart or you stumble over your words, just take a deep breath and kind of move forward. They're everyone at the interview. They want you to succeed. They want to have good doctors and good colleagues with them. And so I think that that's something to kind of keep in mind as well, is that they're not looking for you to mess up. They want you to succeed. And I know that people said this to me when I was interviewing, and I was like, yeah, right. They want everyone to do this, and they just say that, but they really do mean that. And there's a lot of diversity within medicine. Even with my own medical school class, we have people who were I have a good friend who was in the OHL, and people who were engineers, and people who had a whole other career. We have someone who is a pilot. They're really looking for someone who's going to be interesting, who's going to be a great colleague to work with, and that's really what they want. So just be yourself, be kind, and show that you have a good personality. So was there anything that caught you by surprise during your interview process? Hmm. I don't think there was anything that overly caught me, by wild surprise, other than I think that when I was thinking about my interviews and I was getting ready to go into them, I really thought I was going to be more nervous than I actually was. And I think what's really great, and I'm not sure how this will translate to the online format, but at least for my interviews that were in person, um, the school does a really great job at kind of calming you down right before the interview. So for most of the schools, they actually have a full presentation that they'll give, and they'll take you on a tour. And so that gets to happen right before your interview, and then you go in and you're comfortable in your environment, and the interviewers are so very, very conversational. I really thought that I was going to enter into the interview and they were going to just be listing off questions to me, and I would just, have to be spewing out these perfect answers. But as I mentioned previously, even in one of my U of T interviews, myself and the interviewer just talked about what I ate for dinner the night before for the first probably 5 minutes of my 12-minute interview. And so it really is very conversational, and very kind of comfortable and easy to kind of get along with everyone there. They really do just want to get to know you, and I think it's a really receptive environment for that. And even within actually my online interview, my panel interview, again, the first couple of minutes were just talking about the craziness of COVID and how we were all adjusting to the online format. And so I do really think that it's not as stressful as you think it's going to be, and how not as stressful as, people talk about it in the past. It is, of course, a very stressful environment because you are interviewing, but they really do their very best to kind of calm you down and get you ready. So those are all the questions that I have on my list. does anyone have any questions in the comment that I can answer for? The other thing that I really will emphasize again is just I really do think the best thing to do is to practice. Um, when you feel comfortable saying your answers and have kind of talked about this in the past, that is really an asset, because you're just going to be able to speak more freely. And I also think it's important that you practice with different people. So if you're practicing with your friend who's your bestie and your roommate, and you only feel really comfortable talking with them, you're never going to get that nervous feeling. And so I would practice with people who I didn't really know too well, who were maybe acquaintances in my program, or with somebody who I met at a random event, and we'd only talked and we just briefly speak about the fact that we both had an interview. um, and so I think it's important to kind of switch up who you're interviewing with and try and practice your interviews with people who you don't know and who you kind of want to make a good impression with. And so I guess an example of that would be I practiced with somebody who I met at like a random healthcare event, and I'd spoken to them for 10 minutes, and they mentioned that they had an interview at U of T and I had an interview at U of T, and we met on FaceTime and practiced our interview prep. And I was nervous because I didn't know them and I wanted them to think that I was, a good interviewer. And so I think that was an asset for myself. And then the other thing I guess that I actually didn't mention before that surprised me about the interviews is the people that you interview with. At least, this is just the stat of U of T, but it's similar in other schools as well. Is that 50% of the people who get an interview will get in. So a lot of the people who were sitting around me during my interview were in my or who were my classmates now. And so my roommate, actually, I met on interview day. We just sat next to each other and we were in the same MMI or MPI circuit. So the people that you meet on interview day or the people that you meet during interview prep um, could actually be your really close friends. And so I wouldn't think of everyone as competition. I would think of them as people who could be your future classmates and your future best friends. So I would just go into the actual day being calm, getting to know some people. And I found talking to people around me for the online interview format. I'm not sure if this will be possible, but they may have kind of a group chat with everyone who has an interview, or if they have a social event the night before. My understanding is that they're trying to integrate some of those, so you have a chance to ask medical students questions. Attend those things, get to know the medical students at that school, get to know the other people interviewing, because those could be, your best friends for the next 4 years. And really take time to enjoy the interview. It's a very stressful time, but you'll get through it, and stay positive for sure. So I think that's all the time or all the questions that we have. Um, Oh, I just got a new question here. So do they ask medical ethics questions? So that's a great question. Yes, they do. So what I would recommend in order to prep for that is I would read Doing Right. I think it's by Brian Goldman. It's a book about medical ethics, and they're not specifically looking for you to answer um, the most correct possible thing. So you're not meant to know the rules of what to do in the situation. I think they're more looking for your morals behind it. So I'll give an example. So this is not a question that I was asked. We're not allowed to disclose questions that we are specifically asked, but this is a question that I prepped for and that I've heard that other people have been asked is you have a 13-year-old that comes into your office, you're a physician, and they want an abortion, and they tell you that their parents would not be happy with hearing this. What do you do? And so I think in this situation, you don't need to necessarily know that every single that you can at any age you can have a patient consent to any procedure. You don't necessarily need them to be a certain age or need parental consent. But I think that the way that you approach the question and kind of being sensitive towards that individual and kind of respecting patient autonomy and patient care and that confidentiality, kind of those main pillars that they talk about in Doing Right with confidentiality, autonomy, non-maleficence, those main kind of pillars are what you need to know. And do I think that there's any harm in actually knowing some of these medical ethics rules that, any patient can consent to something at any age as long as they're competent? I think that that can definitely be beneficial, but I don't think it's necessarily necessary to have those kind of information. But you definitely be prepared to answer some medical ethics questions. I've been asked medical ethics questions at every single interview. That's something that you should be well versed in. I guess something else that I'll just mention here quickly is that there are certain types of questions that they'll ask you during the interviews. So one of them is medical ethics. Another one that they'll ask is just about yourself, or why medicine, or what are your goals. So kind of a personal oriented question. Then they'll give what if situations. Uh, and then tell me a time when. And usually those tell me a time whens are revolved around the CanMeds. Tell me a time when you were a leader, or here's a situation that you are in, you're a medical student and this happens, what would you do? And so I think it's really important to kind of be versed in those types of answers. I think a lot of the medical ethics questions are around the same style, and even some of the exact same questions that you would have gotten in the Casper test. So to practice for some of those medical ethics questions, I would actually look up Casper practice questions and then practice answering those. Practice going onto YouTube and watching professionals or watching medical ethics experts or interview experts answer those questions, and seeing if your answer sounds similar, or kind of learning some of those basic principles of how to approach questions. I think something that's a positive in any way. So I was just given a question, giving an example of a what if question. Okay, sorry, I'll read it out loud. I kind of mumbled it there. So we were just asked the question, or given a comment. Could you give an example of a what if question? So a potential what if question might be, you are a third year medical student on a internal medicine rotation, and your supervisor refers to the patient in racial slang behind the patient's back when you're at the nurse's station. What do you do? And so being able to kind of talk through what you think are the best things. So maybe the first thing you mention is, this is an issue due to respect, and brings up the topic of racism as well. And so these are things that are not tolerated. Disrespect and racism are not things that I personally don't tolerate, and that should not be tolerated within the medical field. And then talking about what are the kind of options of things that you could do. You could confront the physician, you could report them to advisory board, you could ignore it, you could bring it up in private. And so kind of giving different options out loud to your interviewer about things that you could do, and then talking about maybe some of the pros and cons of those. So a pro of bringing it up to the supervisor who used that slang is that they might have an opportunity to learn, and that they might then be able to understand that that's not an appropriate thing to do to a patient, that we're there to help patients, and using that kind of language can impact care, and is disrespectful. But then maybe you say that a negative of that, which I would be nervous about, is that maybe it would impact the impression that they would have of me. They would be upset at me for bringing that up. They might not write me a good reference letter. Like, you can kind of think of the positive and negatives and then weigh them out, and then say, the positive to doing this other thing is this, and the negative of this other thing is this, ultimately based on kind of the positive and negatives of each of these situations, or each of the solutions that I've presented towards you. I think the best thing for me to do would be to do X, and this is why. And so those are kind of examples of what if situations. Yeah. And then hopefully that kind of answers that question. Are there any more questions or any kind of follow-ups? I hope that was a good enough explanation to kind of answer that. Yeah, so just to kind of elaborate a bit more on the types of questions again, or kind of summarize here. So it's medical ethics, personal, what if, and then give me an example of a time when. And then I would also say another piece of advice are to write down character traits that you have, and then write down character traits that you don't have, that you want to improve on. And I think that would be helpful, because you'll definitely be given times are given questions that'll say, what do you think are your best attributes, or what do you think makes a great physician? And so by being able to kind of pull on those which you have, then you can kind of say, this is what I think makes a great physician, and this is why I have those. And then you might be give me an example of something that you are weak in, or an attribute that you don't have. And then if you're able to kind of talk onto that, this is what I don't have, but these are the steps that I'm taking to get there. And so I think that that's always something that's important, is that whenever you're kind of saying a negative about yourself, is that you always want to have an explanation of how you're going to improve that. And so that's really important as well. Do we have any further questions here? Okay, I'm not seeing any new questions coming into the comment section here. So I think I'll wrap up and give a kind of a summary or a goodbye. So thank you all for coming. I think with interview season, it's very stressful. I know I was very nervous as well, but stay true to yourself. Come across and be a nice person and a personable person that someone would want to work with. Be calm, take some deep breaths before you go in. Speak at a reasonable pace. Don't say anything that you would not normally say. Prepare, practice as much as you can. Know your can meds and times where you showed those positive and negatives of the can meds. Again, if you wanted to look more into the can meds and kind of elaborate more there, they do have the can meds on the U of T medicine website. Yeah, just good luck, everyone. And just as kind of a following here, so MD Consultants provides very comprehensive interview prep through both mock MMI circuits and one-on-one consultations with medical students like myself. So if you were looking to book an appointment, you can visit mdconsultants.ca or email info@mdconsultants.ca. You can kind of set those up, and that will definitely be a great resource for you to all to prep. So thank you all for coming. And again, if you have any questions, you can message into the chat. And if not, then I look forward to seeing some of you at interviews, or at U of T Medicine next year, or through MD Consultants Practice Consultants. So thank you all again, and have a nice afternoon.